Happy Wednesday, everyone. My name is Yiling Zhuang. I'm the Water Resources Regional Specialized Agent in University of Florida IFAS Extension. Welcome to Water Wednesday. Water Wednesday is a webinar series about Florida's precious resource, water. Every Wednesday afternoon at 2 o'clock Eastern Time, we'll live stream a 30-minute talk about Florida's water and what we can do to protect it. We host our webinar series on Zoom and broadcast to Facebook Live. We have attendees all over the world. Please put into the chat box and tell us where you are watching this webinar. If you are viewing it on Facebook, please be aware of the scammers. This webinar series is free. Please do not click any links that are now posted by the admin. We have a theme for every month. This month, we focus on clean water. In last several Wednesdays, we reviewed the clean water policies and regulations in Florida, how to use filters inside the house, and the power of ponds. I will post a link of our recap blogs if you missed the webinar. While we are celebrating the Clean Water Month, this Wednesday is also the Manatee Appreciation Day. As our spring's seasonal visitors, let's switch gear and learn more about Florida springs. Our guest speaker for today is Dr. Andrea Alberton. She is the Water Resources Regional Specialized Agent in Florida Panhandle. Now let's welcome Dr. Alberton.
Hi, Yulin. Thank you so much for inviting me to your Water Wednesday seminar series. Should I go ahead and start my presentation?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me get that going, and then we can go ahead and start. Can you see that? I think so. So I'll move forward. Again, thank you so much for logging on. I will be talking specifically about Florida springs and really water quality and relationships to algal blooms. I'll be presenting some of the research that I did about 10 years ago in spring systems, and these are systems that I think we all enjoy and love here in the state of Florida. Okay, let's get started. So geologists estimate that there are more than 1,000 springs in Florida, and this represents one of the largest concentrations of freshwater springs on Earth. This is a beautiful spring system right here where you can see that water is flowing, and we have a lot of native aquatic vegetation on the bottom. Springs are windows to the Floridan aquifer, and they provide insight to water quality in our groundwater. This is a picture of Ichetucknee Blue Hole for any of you that are in there or would love to visit. It's a phenomenal site to visit. So in fact, most of Florida's water is actually underground, flowing through porous limestone rock, such as what we have pictured here at Ichetucknee, or in loose sand and gravel sediments. So why do we have so many springs in Florida? It's because of our geology and the Floridan aquifer system. These go hand in hand. So this is a map of the Floridan aquifer systems. So backing up a little, aquifers are underground layers of rock that hold and transmit water. So water can be held in porous rock like limestone, what we just saw in the last image, can be loose material like sand, silt, and clay, or it can be held and moved through rock fissures or cracks like you would find in solid bedrock aquifers, which we tend to have further north. So specifically, the Floridan aquifer is actually one of the most productive aquifer systems in the world, transmits a lot of water, and it's made up of a thick sequence of carbonate rock, so limestone, calcium carbonate, as well as dolomite, which is calcium and magnesium carbonate. It encompasses a huge area of about 100,000 square miles, reaching north into Georgia and South Carolina, and west into Alabama. In Florida, it supplies drinking water to about 11 million people. The Floridan aquifer, so this really thick sequence of limestone rock, comes all the way to or very near the surface in many parts of Florida. And this is where we tend to find most of our springs. So most of our springs are located in central and north central Florida, as well as in the Panhandle. In other parts of the state, the Floridan can actually be buried hundreds of feet below the surface. And in these areas, other aquifers lie on top of the Floridan. All in all, more than 95% of the water that we use in Florida for public and private water supply, for landscaping, agriculture, commercial and industrial use, all comes from groundwater. And the majority of this comes from the Floridan aquifer. All right. So I mentioned that one of the main reasons that we have so many springs in Florida was also due to our geology. This is a diagram, a typical slice through of the Floridan aquifer, where it doesn't quite come to the surface, but it's very close. You'll see that a surficial aquifer lies on top of the Floridan. The surficial aquifer here is made of something like unconsolidated or loose sands and clays, and the yellowish bricks below it represent the limestone and that dolomite, that magnesium and calcium carbonate of the Floridan aquifer. So limestone and dolomite are easily dissolved by rainwater that seeps into the ground. So carbon dioxide that's carried in rainwater actually forms a weak acid, carbonic acid, and this dissolves the rocks and creates cavities and caverns. It dissolves limestone. The resulting topography is karst, which is characterized by the presence of sinkholes and springs, caves, and conduits. You can see how much interaction in this diagram there is with what goes on at the surface and our groundwater. So land use activities can directly affect water pretty quickly, particularly near a sinkhole, for example, which provides a direct conduit, a direct connection between the surface and the Floridan aquifer. So many of our springs in Florida have been identified as being impaired by nitrogen. In areas with largely agricultural land use as shown here, which is typical of the Jackson Blue Springs Basin here in the Northwest District where I am, or springs along the Suwannee River, for example, nitrogen from fertilizer use in agriculture has been identified as a major source of impairment to springs, altering the ecological community in spring systems. In springs in more urban areas, so it all depends on land use, septic system, wastewater treatment plants, fertilizer from lawns and sports turf have been identified as major sources of nitrogen, among others. Another thing I wanted to talk about was this difference between confined and unconfined areas of the aquifer. So spring water quality or groundwater quality is particularly susceptible to contaminants in areas of the aquifer that are unconfined. This is where you have unconsolidated, so loose sands and clays directly above the Floridan, for example, and there's a direct path for water to get down into the aquifer. In the confining layer area, it's different. So a confining layer can be dense clay, for example, or other rock that prevents water from flowing directly down into the aquifer. The water below this confining layer can be more protected from direct land use activities above it. So unconfined areas are particularly susceptible to land use activities directly above them. Just wanted to show you some beautiful pictures of the springs that we have throughout the state, because they really are, like, I consider them the jewels of Florida. I love them. So Madison Blue Springs is a spring that we have here in the Panhandle area in Jefferson County. Alexander Springs is found in the Ocala National Forest. Weeki Wachee, found more Southwest Florida and Southwest Florida, and Little River Springs is a spring right off of the Suwannee River. So these are all larger spring systems. Fanning Springs is another large one along the Suwannee, but I wanted to show you some pictures of smaller spring systems that we have. So right next to Fanning Springs, we have Little Fanning, so it's just lower flows. And then in Silver Glen Springs, this is in the Ocala National Forest, there is a large spring boil area, so a huge area where tons of flow comes out, more than 100 cubic feet per second. But you also have other areas where you find these seep springs, these little bubbles that come up in the sand that look almost like quicksand bubbling. So this is just to show you that springs in Florida come in all sizes, and it all depends on flow. So what about springs degradation and problems that we've seen? Anecdotal evidence in the 1980s and the 1990s began showing that these spring systems were changing. So one of the major things that people saw were increases in macroalgae. They were very obvious. And it's a change that caused most people's attention because you have these huge mats of filamentous macroalgae that were being seen in springs throughout the state. So when I say filamentous macroalgae, it's different from one-celled algae like what would be a red tide bloom or these other types of blooms that we tend to see along the coast. Filamentous macroalgae is just how the name sounds. So these are these long filaments of multi-cells, many cells together of algae. So they're very different than our typical algal blooms. There was very little scientific data, so we didn't have a lot of research showing the change, the increase in algae. There weren't many studies done that showed, algal concentrations before and now in the 1980s. But we did have and do have photographic evidence that shows some of these changes quite incredibly. So this here are pictures from Weeki Wachee Springs in the early 1950s. These are images taken from the underwater amphitheater at the spring where the mermaid show goes on still today, actually. And you can see in the background here where the hunter is and also where the mermaids are, you see lots of native vegetation, so eelgrass, for example. And you also see open areas of sand. Look at algae, you do see algae in the background, but everything is sort of in a nice balance. It's all balanced, it's all there, algae is there, but just not in excessive quantities. Here are some pictures of Weeki Wachee Springs when we did sampling there. And you can see the incredible change in terms of quantities of algal biomass. It's a dramatic increase in biomass and a loss of native aquatic vegetation. To be fair, this background photo, this larger photo, is an area just next to the underwater theater, so it's something that the public wouldn't see. So algae isn't removed here. Where the mermaids are now, they actually physically remove. But in any case, huge increases in algal biomass. Other things were happening. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, I was jumping ahead. So what are the problems? Why do we worry about filamentous algae? Why do we worry about this algae? So problems associated, they actually cause impacts all along the food web. So in this first picture, top left, you can see that aquatic vegetation is outcompeted by these long filaments, this algal biomass. So basically it can grow on the leaves, it can grow around it, it reduces light to aquatic vegetation, and eventually, if it grows enough, it can take over and the aquatic vegetation disappears. On the right-hand side, Elin mentioned that today is Manatee Appreciation Month. This is actually a picture when we were sampling at Manatee Springs of a manatee that had come in the morning. And normally manatees come into our spring systems in the winter time when the weather is cold, so the water in spring systems is actually warmer than along the coast, and manatees will come in and feed off the native vegetation, the eelgrass, and then they also calve. So here you can see Manatee Springs where there's very little native vegetation left. Manatee comes in, and because there's no food for them there, they actually spend less time in the spring run and have to go back out to the river or to the coast. Another major problem with algae, image on the lower left-hand side, is aesthetics. So this is a spring, a county park off of the Swanee River, and you can see that algae is just not pretty. Many of our springs are huge recreational attractions in Florida, so the aesthetics are greatly reduced. It's not so pleasant to be swimming in lots of algae. Also, in areas where there is very low flow, as is pictured here, the decomposition of the algal biomass when it dies increases what we call biological oxygen demand in the water. So basically the bacteria that decompose the algae use oxygen in the decomposition process. And this means that oxygen in the surrounding water is reduced. And this can be a problem for organisms living in that area. This is Granato Springs off of the Swanee, if you don't know that county park. Then on the bottom right, What I've shown here again is this long horsehair algae, Macroalgae woolii. It's a cyanobacteria, and a problem that it can cause is that people can be allergic to it. It causes something called swimmer's itch. So just some of the detrimental effects of large algal blooms. So during this time too, there were other observed changes in spring systems. The algal problem was just the most obvious, but there were definitely reductions in springs discharge, so reduced flows. This is usually due to large-scale drought events, for example. There were increases in invasive aquatic plants, lots of hydrilla, other things coming in, and of course, increases in algal biomass. This resulted in decreases in outcompeted native vascular plants or native vegetation. And there were also changes in fish and invertebrate communities, the macroinvertebrates, the aquatic insects, etc. At the same time period, studies were showing, so we have these great, the USGS does a great job of taking water samples in numerous areas throughout the state, but so we have a long record of water quality in our groundwater and our spring systems. So nitrate concentrations in the water column of many springs throughout the state were increasing. This is shown in red. So basically these are, you can see at Weeki Wachee Springs from 1970 to 2000. Silver Springs is another example, 1950 to 2004. You can see how the nitrate concentrations are steadily increasing in these systems. Yellow is phosphate concentrations, and these did not fluctuate, or they don't fluctuate very much and stayed low. This has to do with the phosphate chemistry, really. We have a lot of naturally occurring phosphate in our rocks, and phosphate binds to calcium and aluminum, gets bound up. It doesn't leach into groundwater like nitrate does. So those concentrations did not fluctuate so much. So really, the focus was on nitrogen. And this led people to wonder, sort of an obvious question, hey, is the increase in algal biomass a direct consequence of increased nitrate levels in the Floridan aquifer? And algae was the focus, really, because that was what was just sort of most shocking, right? That was just very prevalent throughout and easier to see. So what did this lead to? The Florida Springs Initiative was launched by FDEP, Florida Department of Environmental Protection, in 2001. This was established under Governor Jeb Bush, and it was the first comprehensive and coordinated program to increase the protection of the state's more than 1,000 freshwater springs. And the plan was to accomplish this through research, monitoring, education, and landowner assistance. So extension was also involved. I was part of research studies funded by FDEP, Environmental Protection, that were done in partnership with algal ecologists at Michigan State University, they're pictured here, and the University of Florida. So we conducted lots of field surveys and laboratory studies to try to address this question. So part of those field studies included establishing transects and sampling points at more than 28 spring boil areas and subsequent spring runs. So the spring boil areas where the spring comes up in bubbles, and spring runs are just the areas beyond the boil. So we had lots of field sites, and we looked at many variables within each site. So basically we collected information about algal presence and algal biomass and percent cover in an area, how much of the area was covered by algae. We also looked at the sediments and sediment composition, water column chemistry, land use in the area, and other variables. Share some of the very major findings. So basically we found macroalgae, so this filamentous algae, at all 28 spring sites and at all spring run sites as well. So Macroalgae woolii and Vaucheria species were the most common species found. Macroalgae is a blue-green algae, cyanobacteria. Vaucheria is a yellow-green algae. But we did not find any clear relationships between nitrogen and phosphorus in the water column and algal cover and thickness. And I'll show you what I mean by that by showing you a couple of graphs. So basically what these graphs show is the percent cover of Microcera. Here it's still, I forgot to change the name, Lingbia. But basically along the x-axis, y-axis, so the vertical axis, what I'm showing is how much of the transect area, that boil area, was covered by algae. And this is shown as a function on the x-axis, on the horizontal, as a function of what the total concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus were in the water column. So basically what we found was huge variability and no silver bullet. Our working hypothesis was that in areas with low nutrient concentrations, algal cover and biomass would be low, and that in areas with high nutrient concentrations in the water column, algal cover would be high. And really found a mix of everything. The blue points mark different sites. We found a mix of everything, and it was very, very site specific. Some springs had very low nutrient concentrations and very high, up to 80, 90% algal cover in the boil area, for example. And others had really high concentrations and very little algal biomass. Again, it was very site specific. So what's going on? So just show this picture so that you keep in mind that spring systems are meant to flow. It's a constant flow, and that water has nutrients in it, no matter how low those concentrations are. So our group sort of put together a diagram of hypotheses of what might be going on in terms of algae. So water column is an important source of nitrogen to these algae in the sense that they use the nitrogen that's constantly flowing from these spring systems. Even in low concentration springs, 24 hours a day, they're getting a flow with nutrients in it that they can take up. Also, nitrogen and phosphorus trapped inside these algal mats are recycled within the mats. What I mean by this is that some algal mats were very thin, just inches thin, while others were meters thick. And as the algae dies in the internal parts of these mats, those nutrients are recycled within that mat. They're decomposed by the bacteria within that mat, and algae can use that internally recycled nutrient source to grow. Also, sediments appear to be, in the groundwater coming up out of the sediments, a source of phosphorus for these algae. So this is looking at algae and nutrients, but what other factors might be affecting algal blooms and springs communities? And so again, our research wasn't, of course, not the only research that was being done or had been done. And some of later studies have been conducted since. I point out here at the bottom, there was a huge CRISPS study funded by the St. John River Water Management District in 2017. A lot of university researchers participated in that. And I'll also highlight some work by Dina Leibowitz out of UF, out of Matt Cohen's lab, that was done. Again, other studies were done as well. But basically this increasing body of work, ones I mentioned here and others, is showing that one, having enough water flow is very crucial to sloughing off this long filamentous algae. So if you can picture the algae the eelgrass that you see in the bottom of this picture, it's pretty much clear of algae, but these long filaments tend to hang on to the vegetation, and if you have enough flow, it can be sloughed off, so it doesn't just sit there and that biomass increase. So flow is hugely important. Another thing too is that excess nutrients, nitrogen, has a detrimental effect on aquatic communities. So what I want to say is our study focused on algae, but other studies were looking at other organisms, and they did find relationships with increasing nitrogen, detrimental effects on other organisms such as macroinvertebrates, native vegetation, etc. Finally, back to algae, Dina Leibowitz, who I mentioned before, did studies about the effects of algal grazers, so snail communities, for example, and how those affect algal biomass in a springs boil area. So basically the idea here is that low oxygen concentrations, if they're reduced, if they're coming out of the spring water, cause a reduction in algal grazing community. They can't handle those low oxygen conditions. Many die off, and then this can result in an increase in algal biomass. So no longer are the grazers there, and the algae can proliferate. So when are oxygen concentrations reduced? This is when water levels in the aquifer are reduced. So this occurs during periods of drought or flood. And what tends to happen here is that we don't have recharge from rain into the aquifer, and rainwater has a lot of oxygen in it. And so what comes up out of the aquifer, instead of sort of this recharged oxygen-rich water, is older water from deeper portions of the aquifer that don't have oxygen. This causes a reduction in that grazing community and can lead to increased algal biomass. So just some other working hypotheses of what could be going on in addition to the nutrient increases in these systems. So in response, what is occurring in Florida to keep and protect springs from further degradation, and I'm jumping ahead to 2016 here, the state legislature passed the 2016 Florida water bill. And a huge component of this water bill was the creation of a whole new category of protected waters in the state. This was done through the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act. And as the name says, was created to protect Florida springs. And it really targets our outstanding Florida springs, which are our historic first magnitude, which is flow. We have about 30 of them in the state. So these are springs that flow at rates of equal to or more than 100 cubic feet per second. So our larger springs, this is about 64 million gallons a day. DEP found that 24 out of 30 of these outstanding springs have been identified as nitrogen impaired. So in response, when a spring is identified as nitrogen impaired, a basin management action plan goes into play. And what these are, they're roadmaps, they're action items lined out of how to reduce nitrogen loading to those systems. This can include, it all depends really on the land use in your area. This can include septic system remediation plans if septic systems are found to be a huge contributor of nitrogen to those spring systems. Can include fertilizer ordinances in urban areas, if those are important sources, or in agricultural areas, it really involves the implementation of best management practices by producers. Just some of the ways that this reduction in load is being addressed by the state to prevent these springs or to sort of help them reduce those nitrogen inputs. Finally, this is my last slide. I just wanted to show you where we are with Bmaps or basin management action plans in general. This is a map by DEP, and they're not all created to protect springs. They're created to protect water, impaired water bodies all throughout the state. But for example, if you look up north at where Leon County, Wakulla, this whole entire thing where I have my arrow now is the Basin Management Action Plan to protect the water quality that's coming out of Wakulla Springs. So in the entire state, DEP had a legislative deadline to release 13 outstanding Florida springs by July 2018, and they did that, and 8 are now fully in effect, and 5 are being challenged in the courts, and so they're pending on decisions in the court system to either be modified or to continue forward. So again, that's the end of my talk, just a very quick overview of a huge topic, but I welcome any questions that you might have now.
That was great. Thank you, Andrea. We do have 2 questions. I see it's already on Zoom. So the first question is there anything in place to restore the native vegetations in these springs?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't work in that specifically, but when I've been to conferences or talk with friends, the water management districts and other state parks, I know several areas where they actually did planting of native vegetation and putting that in to see. Another thing too to remember is that not only does the algae affect it, but people do too. So in many areas, the native vegetation was removed by people because they wanted to see like a nice sandy bottom and not have to spring in these, not have to swim in this. And then if you go to any state park, you can also see that in the summertime, the bottom is clear, but then in the wintertime where there are no people, you tend to see more vegetation and more algae in there. So I do know that water management districts, and I'm sure state parks and others have projects to plant and replant native vegetation, but I'm not specifically familiar with those.
That was great. It tied to the next question very well, because the next question is, how has COVID-19 helped or harmed the springs?
That's a very good question. So it will be, so I didn't go to spring systems during COVID. So I haven't been to a system since March 2020, I have to say. But what we would see seasonal, and so if anyone else on the call has, on the Zoom has any information about it, I'd love to hear it. But we would sample in the summer and in the spring, and just seasonal differences that I would notice that had to do with tourism were exactly that. People trample vegetation. And then, so in the summer, everything was trampled, a lot of things were gone. In the wintertime, when there were no people, is when we saw sort of that coming back in of algae and other things. So I'm assuming, and this is just a guess, that that may be the same thing that's happening systems. So it'd be great if someone from DEP or from one of the state parks was on to let us know, but that would be my guess.
It would be really interesting to know. I read some articles that during COVID, some areas, the air quality is getting better, and some areas, the whole ecosystem actually it's restoring. It's just quite fascinating to read stories like that. We'll be interested to know how it affects our Florida springs.
Absolutely.
I'm still checking the questions, so now I'm going to move to Facebook, because I know for Facebook we have about 10 seconds delay. So if you have any questions, you probably already got enough time to type in your questions. I do post a link here. I already posted a link in the chat box. One is to our recap blogs. It's all the Water Wednesday blogs. You click that link, you can find it. And before everyone leaves, I also put a link of our evaluation. So you can, we will appreciate you just take a minute or so to take this survey, tell us what you have learned and how we can improve that. Now I'm moving to the Facebook side. I see a question pop up. So how many second magnitude springs are there in Florida? Are any Bmaps being implemented for these?
I don't know how many second magnitude springs there are, but yes, there are Bmaps implemented. And so the outstanding Florida, well, I don't know about Bmaps, but definitely they're being protected under the Protection Act includes the 2016 water bill. It includes the first magnitude, and then I think about 5, and I don't remember, 5 second magnitude springs, more in Central Florida. I'm thinking of Ponce de Leon Springs. There are a few others. I apologize, Gemini Springs, that I don't remember. I don't have that list memorized, but there are some second magnitude springs protected under the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act.
I just posted a link to FDEP, Florida Department of Environmental Protection Basin Management Action Plan, which is BMAP. So this link, you can find a complete list of all the BMAPs. Because to be honest, on top of my head, I cannot remember how many springs second magnitude. I do remember the volume, actually, it's because first magnitude it's more than 6.4 million per day. So this is between it's million, how to, because I remember it in million, so it's below 0.64 million and more than 0.064 million. I think I'm making everyone more confused.
No, it's the magnitude system is that it's 100 cubic feet per second up for first magnitude, 10 cubic feet per second to 100 for second magnitude, 1 to 10 for third magnitude, and I just don't know how many are second. It's a good question though, making us work.
So another question here is, what is the nature of legal suit regarding the North Florida Springs BMPs?
So I'm assuming you're talking about the ones, the Bmaps that are showed that are still being contested. So those are being contested by environmental groups and other groups that feel that the Bmaps, the actions outlined in each Bmap, say for the Swanee or for others, I can go back, that they don't go far enough in laying out things that need to be done to bring down those nutrient reductions. So basically those are it's the basic premise of most of them. I don't know the specifics of each case, but that's basically what it is. Those groups feel that the Bmaps need to have sort of more stricter rules or more encompassing rules to get those nitrogen concentrations down.
Great, because I'm still checking my Facebook. You know how technology works. So when you want your computer to be fast, it's super slow. So I'm still checking the questions here. I don't see any questions on the Facebook end. But you know, it's if you have any questions, you can email me or you can email Andrea. If I find any questions on the Facebook end, I will also reply to your comment. And it's getting close to, actually, we still have 10 minutes left. If you have more questions, feel free to put in the chat box. If not, I still want to say we have our evaluation survey. We will really appreciate you can take the survey and just a little bit preview of next month. Because like I mentioned at the beginning, every month we have a theme. This month it's the clean water theme. And the next month we'll focus on water conservation. And as a start, the first talk will be an overview of Florida's water. So questions like, do we have enough water? Because I often hear it's Florida is 3 sides surrounded by water. Why do we need to conserve water? If you also have these questions or your friends have those questions, I encourage you to invite them to attend our Water Wednesdays. You can find the link on our Facebook page, or you for the Zoom webinar viewers, so you can find these links from whichever social media platform you find our link. You can also find our webpage, which is the MREC, UF-IFAS MREC webpage. So with that, I'm checking our Facebook for the last time because I really don't want to miss any questions when Andrea is still here. She's our spring expert. Want to take this opportunity to get all the questions answered. Seem like all the questions have been addressed. So with that, I appreciate your time and really appreciate Andrea for this informative presentation, and hope you all enjoy the rest of your Wednesday afternoon. Bye now.
Thank you. Thanks, Yilin.